Now YouTube, welcome back. Let's kick things off today by installing the ring socket nut. Now it is possible during the disassembly side of the rebuild to not remove this special nut. However, if you count on changing the crankshaft left-hand side bearing, you'll have to take it off. Now a special tool is necessary to take off the nut and to torque it back down after. However, if you're in a pinch, let's say you're waiting for your special tool to be delivered, you can always knock it off with a punch and a hammer. Now I know that this tool is pretty pricey, but do not skimp out on this rebuild, especially when it comes to engine bearings. The one in question is the left-hand side crankshaft bearing, and I highly recommend changing it if you have the crankcases split. In order to tighten down the nut to its required 108 Newton meters, you're going to have to install your Motion Pro gear jammer between the clutch basket and the primary gear. Now I've already mentioned the utilization of the ProCycle Motion Pro gear jammer in my previous episodes. However, make sure to install it correctly. You want to preload the gears and then torque down, otherwise the gear jammer will just pop out of place. Grab your favorite torque wrench and tighten that up. Next is this oil windage plate. Now this plate is surprisingly sharp, so be careful not to tear up your rubber glove. This plate is held in place by 3 Japanese industrial standard screws. There's no torque spec, so I install some Loctite with them and then I tighten them down and give them a couple taps with my impact hammer. Now a word of caution, don't drop those screws into the crankcases. It's pretty easy to forget that there is a gap directly underneath the windage plate, and although I haven't tested to see if the screws do fall through, it's good practice to add a rag just to prevent any unnecessary surprises, should we say. Moving on to the ignition flywheel starter gear clutch. This gear sits directly on the windage plate. The same principles apply to this bearing. I'm going to clean the mating surfaces thoroughly before installing the new one. Now, although all parts were thoroughly cleaned before attacking this rebuild, I'm still going to give it a quick wipe with some rubbing alcohol to eliminate, micro residue, should we say. Once it's nice and clean, let's move on to the installation. When installing bearings, you have to install them straight, and with this sort of bearing, you only have one shot at it. You could reuse them if they've, been installed, jammed, crooked to one side, but I don't recommend it. So the most efficient way to square it off correctly the first time is to use a flat piece of metal. So I'm using the sleeve to my clutch basket holding tool. And this makes sure that the pressure that I'm applying to it with the hammer is even and that the bearing falls in flush. Now, as you can see, installing this bearing is dead simple. However, make sure not to, install it too far down, so you want an even amount on both sides. And the most efficient way to make sure that you're not getting this wrong and that you're getting it right is to measure the distance between the bearing and the surface of the gear beforehand, before taking off the old bearing. Now hold your horses. Before installing the gear with its respective washer, go ahead and add some assembly lube on the gear, the new bearing, its washer, and finally the shaft. Now you can go ahead and install the respective washer and the gear. It's a good idea to give it a couple spins just to make sure that there's no binding and it turns as it should. So, moving on to the flywheel magneto rotor. I'm replacing the starter clutch one-way bearing. Now before installing it, make sure to add some assembly lube. Position the bearing inside the metal circle. Make sure that the circle, however, is installed the correct way. The metal circle has an arrow on one of the 2 sides. Make sure that that face is facing upwards towards you so you can see it while you're torquing it down. all 6 of the bolts get some Loctite. Now I couldn't find a torque specification for these bolts, so I'm going to torque them down and then give them an 1/8 to a 1/4 turn. Just for safe measure, be generous with the Loctite. Once that's done, go ahead and coat the whole assembly with a generous amount of assembly lube. Put the rotor to the side and let's move on to the woodruff key. Installing this woodruff key should be fairly straightforward, however, handle this with precaution. Make sure that the rotor is completely on there, so don't be afraid to give it a couple shoves just to make sure that it's completely seated. Once that's done, let's secure it in place with its bolt and hand tighten it. We can now go ahead and give the engine a couple revolutions just to make sure that there's no binding and that everything moves as it should. Make sure to keep the cam chain under tension, however, otherwise you'll cause some binding on the clutch side. Voila, perfect. Let's go ahead and tighten that bolt down. This bolt requires a whopping 160 Newton meters. And of course, we're going to be utilizing our Motion Pro gear jammer. And quick shout out to them because this tool is great for these sorts of rebuilds. Place the gear jammer between the clutch basket and the primary gear, and you can now go ahead and torque down the bolt to 160 Newton meters. It's also a good idea to give the engine a couple revolutions just to make sure that there's no binding and everything turns as it should. Once again, make sure to keep that cam chain under tension. Now before continuing the stator side of the rebuild, we're now at a step where I like adding the starter motor. Adding it now makes it a little easier down the line. I'm also going to be doing a partial rebuild, changing out a couple O-rings and greasing that famous copper washer. Now I won't be walking you through the entire process as this is pretty self-explanatory. I will however touch on the starter motor cap. When you're putting back together the starter motor, make sure to install it the correct way and not upside down. It's a good idea to mark the starter motor cap along with the starter motor so you know which orientation to place the starter motor cap once come reassembly. Now that you've finished servicing the starter motor, slide it in and you can secure it in place with the 2 fixation bolts. Both the bolts get some Loctite and are hand threaded, tightened down between an 1/8 to a 1/4 turn. Moving on to the rest of the assembly. This solid starter idle gear is a 2-piece assembly. You have the gear and its shaft. Lubricate both components and then pop them into place. Make sure that the gear is on the correct way and not upside down. Now, whilst installing the shaft into the ball, make sure that it's correctly seated. It's possible that there's a little air pocket which forms underneath the shaft, which gives you the impression that it's completely seated, but it isn't. The solution is pretty straightforward. Push down firmly on the shaft for 10 to 15 seconds and that should bleed out all the air. Give the magneto rotor a couple spins just to make sure that the starter idle gear engages as it should, and voila. Moving on to the second part of the starter clutch assembly. It's time to install the limiter assembly starter idle gear. The next part is very important. There are 2 models. The one I have here, which is the good starter idle gear limiter assembly, and then there's a solid one, and that solid one has been known to break and cause catastrophic engine failure. Although this gear is only present on 98 through to 99 models, I would definitely check it if your DR is a 97 or a 2000 model. There could be some production backlog, which means that although your DR is a 2000, it could be a 99 model registered a year later. This is an easy fix and I would definitely recommend doing it if yours has this gear present. A second-hand limiter assembly gear will cost you around the 40-50 euro mark, around $50. It's definitely worth getting this done. The limiter assembly is a 6-piece assembly. You have the gear in question, 2 washers and 2 bushings. In chronological order, it's bushing washer, gear, washer bushing. The same principles apply to this gear as to the previous one. Make sure to coat everything with a generous amount of assembly lube, and when you add the gear, make sure to bleed the air out. Once both gears are in, turn the generator rotor a tiny bit just to make sure that everything engages as it should. Let's move on to the stator cover. First, let's install the starter motor bearing. This bearing isn't a tight fit, so it doesn't require heat or cold. It is still, however, a good idea to take the appropriately sized socket to square it off. The bearing is held in place with a singular circlip. Make sure to install circlips flat side facing outwards towards you. Keep in mind that circlip installation is delicate and don't overstretch the circlip. Once the bearing is in place, coat it with some assembly lube and give it a couple spins. Let's move on to the stator coil. Position your stator and secure it in place with its 3 bolts. All the bolts get some Loctite, hand tightened, and then tighten a 1/4 turn. Now I'm assuming you've done your homework, you've done your due diligence, and that your stator coil is in good condition. However, if you notice some discoloration, some burning, it might be a good idea to check out the coil's resistance with a multimeter, and to even change it out if necessary. Next, let's install the pickup coil signal generator. This one is held in place with 2 Japanese industrial standard screws. They both get a dab of Loctite and a couple taps with the impact hammer. Make sure to correctly route the cable coming from the stator coil before screwing down this signal generator. And finally, to finish off this assembly, we're going to secure down the rubber piece inside the stator cover. It's necessary to install this rubber piece with some RTV. I'm using the Ultimate Black RTV silicone sealant. Apply a generous amount on both the rubber connection and the inside of the ball, and then push down firmly for around 30 seconds. Whilst you're keeping firm pressure on the rubber connection, make sure to wipe off any excess inside and out. All that's left is to install the singular dowel, the gasket, and to bolt the cover down. Before installing the dowel pin, make sure to coat it with a generous amount of anti-seize. Position the dowel pin and let's move on to the gasket. Before installing the gasket, it's important that the mating surfaces are clean. Put some rubbing alcohol on a clean microfiber rag and give it a good wipe down. Before positioning the gasket, I coat both sides with some white lithium grease. This makes it much easier come the time to take off the stator cover. I can guarantee you that whilst you did the disassembly of your DR engine, you had the gasket baked on there and it was a nightmare to get off. A quick side note, to take off old gaskets, don't use a metallic razor blade as you'll damage the mating surfaces. Plastic razor blades and acetone work perfectly. Once the gasket has been coated, position it in place. We can now go ahead and position the stator cover bolts. Hand thread all the bolts and then in a crisscross fashion tighten them down to a quarter turn. Once all the bolts are snug, tighten them down to 6 Newton meters. It's imperative that you tighten them down in a crisscross fashion to not overload the bolts individually. Now that the cover has been bolted down, it's a good idea to turn over the engine a couple revolutions just to make sure that everything moves as it should. Make sure again to keep the cam chain under tension. And voila, everything rotates as it should, there's no binding, so we finished up on the stator side of things. I won't be installing both the timing plugs just yet, as I'll need the timing inspection holes to time the engine in a later episode. However, it's a great idea to cover both inspection holes with a piece of tape to, let's say, avoid any unwanted surprises.